and Wild Bill are going to go into this house looking for this creature that is real territorial. He is a very intelligent creature.
That's a thing's nest. Look, there's...
He's gone. He's gone.
And I'm pretty damn sure we just found. Looks like he slid right out the house.
The camera flickers to life in what appears to be a dimly lit cabin somewhere deep in the Appalachian wilderness. The wood-paneled walls are bare except for a single hunting rifle mounted above a stone fireplace. In the center frame sits Jacob "Buck" Lowe, and if you've followed mountain monsters over the years, you'll know immediately that something is wrong. His face, weathered by years in the mountains, carries a fresh intensity in his eyes. That old scar running along his jawline, the one fans have always asked about, seems deeper in this lighting. His hands rest on a worn wooden table, fingers laced together, trembling slightly. This isn't the Buck we've seen cracking jokes between commercial breaks or rallying the team with that signature enthusiasm. This is a man who has carried a weight for far too long. "I need to tell you something," he begins, his voice gravelly and deliberate. "Something I should have said years ago. Something that's kept me awake more nights than I care to count." He pauses, glancing off camera, as if checking to make sure he's truly alone. When he speaks again, there's an urgency that cuts through the digital distance between him and whoever is watching. What you saw on Mountain Monsters, what we all saw, that was only part of the story. The cameras captured hunts, they captured evidence, but they didn't capture everything. They couldn't. Some things were too dangerous to air. Some things were deliberately hidden. And some things. He trails off, swallowing hard. Some things we're still trying to understand. Within minutes of this video going live, social media explodes. Reddit threads multiply faster than moderators can keep up. Twitter, now X, becomes a firestorm of speculation. Fans who grew up watching the Ames team track creatures through West Virginia's darkest forests are now watching one of their heroes do something unexpected. Confess. This isn't a promotional stunt for a new season. This isn't a teaser or a throwback clip. This is Jacob Lowe, alone in the mountains, breaking years of silence about what really happened when the cameras stopped rolling. And judging by the fear etched into his expression, what he's about to reveal will change everything we thought we knew about mountain monsters, and perhaps about the mountains themselves. "I'm recording this because I don't know how much time I have," he says, leaning closer to the camera. "If something happens to me, I need people to know the truth. I need them to understand that what we chased out there in those woods wasn't just folklore. It wasn't just entertainment." His eyes narrow, reflecting something between regret and resolve. It was real, and it's still out there. The screen holds on his face for a beat longer than comfortable, and then he begins to speak about the things they swore they'd never discuss. For years, fans have whispered about the strange circumstances surrounding mountain monsters, production shutdowns that were never explained, episodes that were filmed but never aired, cast members who left the show without warning. Internet forums have been dissecting every frame, every interview, every cryptic social media post, looking for clues about what really went on behind the scenes. Jacob addresses these rumors head-on, and his confirmation sends chills through anyone who's been paying attention. "People have asked me at conventions, at gas stations, even at my own front door, 'Buck, what really happened during those lost episodes?' And I'd smile, I'd deflect, I'd tell them it was all television magic." He shakes his head slowly. "But that was a lie. Not a complete lie, but enough of one to let me sleep at night. The truth is, there were things we encountered out there that even the crew couldn't explain. Things that made seasoned cameramen refuse to go back into certain locations. Things that had our sound engineers packing up equipment and driving home in the middle of shoots." He leans back in his chair, the wood creaking under the shift in weight. "You want to know about the production shutdowns? Let me tell you about standing in the middle of Tygart Valley at 2 in the morning, filming a routine investigation, when every single piece of electronic equipment we had just died. Not low battery, not malfunction, dead, simultaneously." The weight of his words settles like morning fog over a hollow. And in that darkness, in that complete silence, we heard it. All of us, the entire team, A sound that wasn't animal and wasn't human, but was somehow both and neither at the same time. A howl that seemed to come from underground and overhead all at once. And then, he pauses, his jaw clenching. Then we felt the ground shake. Not like an earthquake, like something massive moving beneath us. Jacob's quote becomes the spine of this entire revelation. Some things we found out there weren't meant to be found. It's not a dramatic soundbite crafted for clicks. It's a warning delivered by someone who's seen what happens when you ignore those warnings. The woods were never silent when filming stopped, he continues, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Strange lights that moved with intelligence, not like flashlights or drones, but like something observing, calculating. There were nights when we'd wrap for the day and drive back to base camp, only to realize we'd lost 3 hours somewhere between the hunt site and the parking lot. No memory of the drive, no explanation for the time. He describes the sensation that became all too familiar to the team, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Not the kind of attention you get from wildlife observing potential threats. This was different, predatory, intelligent, ancient. This wasn't television anymore, Jacob says, his eyes meeting the camera with an intensity that makes you want to look away. This was survival. Everything Jacob is about to reveal traces back to one man, John Trapper Tice, the team's beloved leader who passed away in 2019. To fans, Trapper was the heart of Mountain Monsters, the strategist, the mentor, the man whose passion for Appalachian mysteries made the show what it was. But according to Jacob, Trapper's final investigation uncovered something that the network, and perhaps others, desperately wanted to keep buried. Trapper wasn't just a television personality, Jacob explains, pulling out a faded photograph of his old friend. He was a genuine researcher, a man who had been tracking these creatures, these phenomena, long before the cameras ever showed up. He had notebooks going back 30 years, connections to other hunters and researchers across multiple states. When we started filming, he saw it as an opportunity to finally document what he'd been chasing his whole life. The story Jacob tells next happened during what would become one of the show's final seasons. The team had been investigating reports of strange activity deep in the Tygart Valley, an area of West Virginia so remote that cell service is a myth, and the nearest town is an hour's drive on dirt roads that barely deserve the name. We were following a trail Trapper had marked on one of his old maps, Jacob recalls. He'd been to this area decades before, heard stories from local families about things living in the mountain that predated European settlement. Things that the indigenous people had learned to avoid, to respect, to leave alone. 3 days into the expedition, they found it. A sealed wooden chest buried beneath the exposed roots of a lightning-struck oak tree. The chest itself was old, handcrafted, bound with iron fixtures that had rusted through decades of mountain weather. But it was the symbols carved into the lid that stopped them cold. Those symbols matched markings we'd seen in other locations, Jacob says, pulling out copies of photographs. Different counties, different years, same exact designs. Trapper recognized them immediately. He'd been documenting them for years, trying to understand what they meant, who made them, and why. Inside the chest, they found bones, not human, but not any animal the team could identify. They found maps, hand-drawn and incredibly detailed, marking locations throughout Appalachia. And they found a photograph, black and white, creased with age, showing 3 men standing in front of a cabin. On the back, written in faded ink, "They're still watching." 1952. Trapper became obsessed with that photograph, Jacob remembers, his voice heavy with something between admiration and regret. He believed it was proof that others had known about what we were finding, that there was a lineage of knowledge, maybe even protection, around these phenomena. He wanted to find out who those men were, what they knew, and what happened to them. The team fractured over what to do with the discovery. The network wanted to feature the chest in an episode, turn it into compelling television, and move on to the next hunt. But Trapper refused. He insisted that what they'd found was too important, too dangerous, to be reduced to entertainment. He spent his final months chasing leads from that chest, Jacob says quietly, visiting libraries, talking to elderly residents in towns that don't appear on modern maps, following a trail that seemed to lead deeper and deeper into something none of us fully understood. And then his voice breaks slightly. Then he was gone. Heart attack, they said. Natural causes. He was alone in his cabin when it happened. But I've always wondered. He stops himself, shaking his head. I've always wondered if what he found was too dangerous for someone to let him share. The section ends with Jacob holding up Trapper's worn leather journal, its pages filled with cramped handwriting and cryptic sketches. Everything I'm about to tell you, he says, Trapper documented it first. This is his legacy, and I'm going to make sure it's not buried with him. Jacob sets the journal aside and begins reconstructing the night they opened the chest in detail, a moment that would alter the trajectory of everything that followed. The team had transported the chest back to their base camp, a converted hunting cabin that served as their headquarters during longer investigations. They waited until after the production crew had left for the night. What they were about to do, they all sensed, wasn't meant for cameras. Trapper used a crowbar to pry off the lid, Jacob recounts, his hands unconsciously mimicking the motion. The hinges fought him every inch. When it finally gave way, this smell hit us. Not decay, exactly, but something old, like opening a door that had been sealed for generations. Inside, layered carefully beneath oilcloth wrapping, they found the items. Brittle journals bound in leather, their pages filled with observations written in multiple hands spanning different decades. Animal bones arranged in patterns that none of them recognized. Detailed maps of the region with certain locations circled in red ink, many of which corresponded to sites the team had already investigated. And the photograph, that haunting photograph. The three men in the picture were dressed like hunters, Jacob describes, but they weren't posing with game. They were standing in front of what looked like a cave entrance or a mine shaft, and they looked tired, haunted, even in a photograph from 70 years ago, like they'd seen something that aged them beyond their years. Trapper had examined the photograph under magnification and discovered something none of them had noticed at first glance. In the darkness of the cave behind the men, there were shapes, indistinct but clearly present, forms that suggested something was watching them from the shadows as the picture was taken. On the back of the photograph, in addition to the date and the cryptic message, there was a symbol, 3 interlocking circles pierced by an arrow pointing downward. The same symbol that appeared on the maps, carved into trees at investigation sites, and now branded into the lid of the chest itself. Trapper called them the Watchers of the Woods, not the creatures the team hunted, but something else entirely. People, perhaps, or an organization that had been monitoring, documenting, or protecting these phenomena for longer than any of them had been alive. The journals supported this theory. Each one contained logs of sightings, encounters, and investigations spanning from the early 1900s through the 1990s. The entries described creatures matching those the team had been chasing, the wolfman, the yahoo, the grassman, but they also described something else, a pattern. The sightings weren't random. They followed routes, appeared in cycles, and seemed to originate from specific locations that the journals called anchor points. Trapper realized we weren't just chasing individual creatures, Jacob explains. We were seeing parts of something larger. A connected system, maybe even a population, that moved through the mountains following routes that had been established long before highways and towns carved up the wilderness. After Trapper's death, the eerie coincidences began multiplying at an alarming rate. The chest, which had been stored in Trapper's cabin, disappeared. Not stolen, the doors were still locked from the inside, just gone. The team members who had been present that night started experiencing strange occurrences. Howls outside their homes that didn't match any known animal, vehicles tampered with, the feeling of being followed even in broad daylight. Most disturbing were the holes. Fresh excavations appearing at sites where the team had previously investigated, as if someone or something was retracing their steps, looking for what they might have left behind or missed. And footage. Hours of footage that the team had personally recorded, verified, and handed over to the network began disappearing from the official archives. Editors would go to pull clips for episodes only to find files corrupted or missing entirely. "We documented finding that chest," Jacob says, frustration clear in his voice. "We had video evidence, photographs, witness testimony from 6 team members, and within months of Trapper's death, it was like it never happened. The files were gone, the physical evidence was gone, and anyone who asked questions was told to move on to the next hunt." But Jacob hadn't moved on. He'd made copies, backed up hard drives, stored them in multiple locations with instructions that if anything happened to him, the files would be released. What he's releasing now, he says, is only a fraction of what still exists. Trapper died trying to connect these dots, Jacob states firmly. "I'm not going to let his work disappear into whatever dark corner someone wants to shove it into. The Watchers of the Woods, whoever or whatever they are, they don't get to decide what truth gets told." The systematic disappearance of evidence became impossible to ignore or dismiss as coincidence. Jacob walks through the timeline with the precision of someone who has rehearsed this testimony countless times, knowing he might only get one chance to deliver it. "After Trapper passed, I started keeping detailed logs," he explains, pulling out a thick binder filled with printed documents, screenshots, and handwritten notes. Every piece of footage we'd shot, I documented. File names, timestamps, content descriptions, who had access to the files. I made myself a walking backup of our investigation. Within 6 months of Trapper's death, Jacob noticed that specific episodes and segments were being labeled as corrupted in the network's archives. But these weren't random technical failures. They were targeted deletions. The missing footage all related to specific investigations, the chest discovery, encounters at sites marked on the hidden maps, and interviews with local residents who claimed to have seen the Watchers themselves. "I went to the editors, people I'd worked with for years," Jacob recounts. "They told me they were just following orders. Segments were being flagged at higher levels for removal or re-editing. When I asked who was giving these orders, I got blank stares and suggested that I focus on filming rather than production decisions." The Ames team began to fracture under the pressure. Some members, spooked by what they'd uncovered and unnerved by the disappearing evidence, wanted to walk away entirely. They'd signed up to hunt legendary creatures, not to be caught in what increasingly felt like a conspiracy that stretched far beyond television production. Others, particularly those closest to Trapper, felt a responsibility to continue his work, to finish what he'd started, and ensure his research didn't die with him. Jacob fell firmly in the latter camp, but even he admits the cost was becoming difficult to bear. "I started receiving phone calls," he says, his voice dropping, "middle of the night, unfamiliar numbers that would disconnect the moment I answered. Then the calls started having voices, distorted, threatening, telling me to leave the valley alone, to stop asking questions, to remember that Trapper had ignored similar warnings." 1 week after the calls began, Jacob returned home to find his truck vandalized, tires slashed, windows broken, but the message was in what was left on his property. A dead deer, throat torn open, positioned carefully on his front porch with its head pointed toward his door. "That wasn't an animal attack," Jacob states flatly. "That was a message. Someone wanted me to know that they knew where I lived, that they were watching, and that they could get to me whenever they wanted." The warning signs were everywhere. Willie and Jeff, other team members, reported similar incidents. Vehicles followed, homes watched, anonymous letters suggesting they should walk away while they still could. The threats were never explicit enough to take to law enforcement, always maintaining plausible deniability, but the intent was crystal clear. "We weren't being hunted by cryptids," Jacob says, the realization heavy in his words. "We were being hunted by people. People who had resources, organization, and a very specific interest in keeping us away from whatever Trapper had been closing in on." The section ends with Jacob revealing his insurance policy. Multiple copies of all the suppressed footage, encrypted and distributed to trusted individuals with instructions for release. Some files were uploaded to secure servers with dead man's switches. Others were hidden in physical locations known only to him and one other team member. If they wanted to silence us, Jacob says with grim determination, they should have done it before we learned how to protect information. This isn't going away. Trappers' work isn't going away. And whatever they're hiding in those mountains, that's not going away either. Despite the threats, despite the evidence tampering, despite every rational voice telling him to walk away, Jacob couldn't abandon what Trapper had started. Earlier this year, he made a decision that would lead to the revelation he's now sharing with the world. I went back, he admits, almost apologetically. I know how stupid that sounds. I know Trapper's fate should have been warning enough. But I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to finish what he'd begun. So I went back to Tygart Valley. Alone. No camera crew, no production schedule, no logos on my truck announcing who I was or what I was doing. He'd planned the trip meticulously, telling no one except his wife where he was going and leaving her with detailed instructions about the backup files should he not return. He brought basic camping equipment, a handheld camera, and copies of Trapper's maps with the anchor points marked. The forest felt wrong from the moment he entered it. The sensation wasn't subtle. It was overwhelming, oppressive, immediate. The valley was silent, Jacob describes, and I don't mean quiet. I mean silent. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees. Just this heavy, waiting silence that made every step I took sound like I was announcing myself to the entire mountain. He followed Trapper's markings to one of the circled locations on the map, a section of old-growth forest that GPS barely penetrated. The journey took him 2 hours of hiking from where he'd left his vehicle, following trails that were barely there, marked by subtle signs that you'd miss if you didn't know what to look for. What he found there made his blood run cold. There were boot prints, Jacob reports, his camera zooming in on photographs he took at the scene. Fresh boot prints, pressed deep into mud that had only been soft from the previous night's rain. Human prints, suggesting someone had been there recently. But surrounding those prints, overlapping them in some places, were tracks I couldn't identify. Too large for any known predator, too structured to be random, and deliberately placed in a circle around the human prints like they were studying them. Nearby, he discovered a cairn, a deliberate stack of stones that hadn't been there on any previous team investigation. At the top of the cairn, protected by a plastic bag, was one of Trapper's missing notebooks. The discovery hit Jacob like a physical blow. This was Trapper's handwriting, his personal journal that had vanished with the chest, and someone, or something, had placed it here, at this exact location, like they wanted it to be found, like they were leaving breadcrumbs. He carefully opened the notebook, his hands trembling slightly in the footage he recorded. The pages contained entries from Trapper's final months, observations and theories that had never made it into any official documentation. But what stopped Jacob's breath was the symbol marked on the inside cover, 3 interlocking circles pierced by a downward arrow. I recognized that symbol immediately, Jacob explains to his current audience. We'd seen it before, carved into trees during investigations in completely different counties. I'd assumed they were random territorial markings or old surveyor signs. But seeing it here, in Trapper's notebook, deliberately placed at a location he'd marked as significant, that's when I understood. This wasn't random. These symbols, these locations, they were all connected. Part of a network that spanned across Appalachia, linking sites where phenomena had been documented for decades, maybe centuries. Trapper had written extensively about this connection in the recovered journal. He'd traced patterns showing that sightings of different cryptids, creatures with completely different descriptions and behaviors, all seemed to radiate from specific geographic points. Areas where the topology created unique conditions, deep valleys, ancient cave systems, places where water collected and geology did strange things to sound and light. The most chilling entry came from just 2 weeks before Trapper's death. In shaking handwriting, he'd written, "They're not protecting the woods. They're protecting what's inside." The Watchers aren't guardians of mystery, they're wardens of a prison, and we've been rattling the bars. Jacob looks directly into the camera, the weight of Trapper's words hanging in the air between past and present. That's when I knew this wasn't about legendary creatures or folklore or even undiscovered species. This was about something deliberately hidden, actively protected, and far more dangerous than any of us had imagined. Trapper had figured that out, and it had cost him everything. Determined to understand what the symbols meant and who the Watchers really were, Jacob did what Trapper had done. He started reaching out to experts, historians, folklorists, anthropologists, anyone who might have knowledge about the symbols and the mythology surrounding these protected sites. Most dismissed his inquiries as conspiracy theory or pseudoscience, but one professor, an expert in pre-colonial Appalachian culture who requested anonymity, confirmed what Trapper had suspected. She told me about warning glyphs, Jacob explains, showing images of symbols carved into ancient stone, markings that indigenous peoples used to designate forbidden ground, places where natural phenomena created dangerous conditions, methane pockets, unstable geology, areas where people would vanish without explanation. These weren't superstitious warnings. They were practical safety measures based on generations of observation. But the symbols Jacob had documented didn't match any known indigenous markings. They were similar in concept, but different in execution, suggesting a later adoption of the practice by people who understood the principle but came from a different tradition. The professor's research led Jacob to obscure historical documents, letters from early settlers describing men who lived in the deep mountains, who warned travelers away from certain areas, who claimed to be keepers of the hollow. These men weren't mountain hermits or random individuals. They were organized. They had knowledge passed down through apprenticeships, and they took their role seriously enough to use violence when warnings were ignored. There are accounts from the 1800s, Jacob shares, of survey parties that went missing in marked territories. Search parties would find their equipment scattered, but no bodies. Local authorities would close the investigations quickly, always with the same conclusion: lost to the wilderness. But the pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. Certain areas were off-limits, enforced not by law, but by something older and more absolute. The parallels to Trapper's writings were undeniable. The more Jacob researched, the more he realized his friend hadn't been chasing monsters. He'd been documenting the remnants of an ancient protective system that still existed in some form. The Watchers weren't villains in some elaborate conspiracy. They were the continuation of something that had been keeping people away from dangerous sites for longer than West Virginia had been a state. But that realization brought a more terrifying question. What were they protecting? What could possibly be so dangerous that it required generations of guardians, symbols carved into stone, and the willingness to use violence to maintain secrecy? Jacob decided he needed to take one more step to find answers. He reached out to Willie and Jeff, hoping they would join him in a final off-grid expedition. Their responses shocked him. Willie told me he'd burned every map, destroyed every copy of footage he had, and begged me to do the same, Jacob recounts. Jeff wouldn't even talk to me on the phone. He sent a text that just said, "Let it die with Trapper, for your own sake." I'd never seen them scared before. These were men who'd walked into the darkest hollers of West Virginia, armed with nothing but flashlights and cameras. Men who'd faced down things that would make most people run screaming. And they were terrified. Only Huckleberry agreed to stand with him. Together they began planning what they called the final expedition, a return to the anchor points Trapper had identified, equipped with proper documentation equipment, backup systems, and a plan to upload everything they found in real time. But 3 days before they were scheduled to leave, Jacob's preparation took a dark turn. Someone broke into his shed where he'd been storing expedition gear. The lock had been cut with professional precision, and inside, everything was gone. GPS units, cameras, camping equipment, even the printed maps he'd prepared. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for, Jacob says, surveying the empty shed in his footage. They didn't take tools or anything valuable. They took only the equipment that would have allowed us to navigate to and document those sites, and they did it quietly enough that neither I nor my neighbors heard anything. More disturbing was what they left behind, a single symbol carved into his workbench, 3 interlocking circles pierced by a downward arrow. The message was unmistakable. Someone had been watching his preparations, knew exactly what he was planning, and was making sure he understood that they would always be one step ahead. That's when the fear really set in, Jacob admits, his voice barely steady. This wasn't theoretical anymore. These weren't warnings from the past. The Watchers, whoever they are, they're still active, still organized, and still absolutely committed to keeping people away from whatever's hidden in those mountains. The terror escalated dramatically in the days following the shed break-in. Jacob had taken every precaution he could think of: security cameras, deadbolts, informing local law enforcement about the previous incidents. But nothing prepared him for what happened the night before he planned to upload his files to the public. It started around midnight, Jacob recalls, his words coming faster now, as if urgency from that night is bleeding into the present. I was in my study, making final backups of everything, when the power went out. Not just my house, the entire road, both directions. Then my cell phone lost signal. Not weak signal, no signal at all, like every tower within range had been shut off simultaneously. He'd grabbed a flashlight and gone to the window, planning to check the breaker box. That's when he saw them. Headlights in the woods behind his property, positioned maybe 100 yards from his back fence. Not moving, just sitting there in the darkness like eyes watching the house. I watched those lights for maybe 5 minutes, Jacob says, his hands unconsciously gripping the edge of the table. They didn't move, didn't flicker, didn't give any indication of who or what was behind them. Then without warning, they just vanished. Not turned off, vanished. No trail of light moving away, no sound of engines or vehicles departing, just sudden, complete darkness. In that darkness, his dog began barking frantically from the backyard, the kind of primal, terrified barking that dogs do when they sense something fundamentally wrong. Jacob armed himself and went outside, his flashlight cutting through the night, his dog backing toward him with hackles raised. He found nothing. No vehicles, no people, no sign that anyone had been there. But as dawn broke a few hours later, and he could finally see his property in daylight, he discovered something that made his blood run cold. There were footprints, he says, showing photographs taken in early morning light. Massive footprints behind my house, starting at the tree line where those headlights had been. But these weren't boot prints. They were too wide, too deep, pressed into ground that should have only left shallow impressions. And they led right up to my back fence, stopped there for what must have been several minutes based on how deep the impressions were, and then returned to the woods following the exact same path. Whatever had made those prints had stood at his fence, watching his house, while he was inside. The measurements he took suggested something over 7 feet tall and heavy enough to sink several inches into relatively firm soil with each step. That was enough. Jacob threw essentials into a duffel bag, took his laptop and external hard drives, and drove through the remainder of the night to meet Huckleberry at a remote cabin they'd agreed upon as an emergency fallback location. I drove for 3 hours, took a route I'd never taken before, doubled back multiple times to make sure I wasn't followed, Jacob describes. When I finally got to the cabin, Huckleberry was already there, looking just as spooked as I felt. Together, they spent the next 2 days recording everything they knew. They created a comprehensive video documentation of Trapper's research, the disappearing evidence, the threats, the encounters, everything that had led them to this point. They made multiple copies of all digital files, storing them on separate drives that they would hide in different locations. They were meticulous, paranoid, and unfortunately, not paranoid enough. 4 days after arriving at the cabin, Huckleberry disappeared. He'd driven into the nearest town to buy supplies and never returned. His truck was found abandoned at a gas station, keys still in the ignition, his wallet and phone left on the seat. Security footage showed him pumping gas, then walking toward the station's convenience store. He was visible in frame one moment, Then the camera glitched for maybe 3 seconds, and when it cleared, he was simply gone. Jacob waited 3 days before Huckleberry finally called from an unknown number. His voice on that call, captured on Jacob's recording, is barely recognizable. Whispered, fractured, terrified. "They know," Huckleberry had said. "They know everything. Every site, every name, every person we've talked to. Buck, they showed me..." The line had crackled with interference. "They showed me what Trapper found. What's actually down there. And we need to stop. We need to stop right now before..." The call cut off. Jacob hasn't heard from Huckleberry since. "I don't know if he's hiding or if they're holding him," Jacob says, and for the first time in this recording, his voice cracks with emotion. "He's my friend. He stood with me when everyone else backed away. And now he's gone because I convinced him to keep digging into something we were never meant to find." This section ends with Jacob alone in frame, the weight of consequences visible in every line of his face. "That night taught me something," he says quietly. "We weren't just being warned anymore. We were being actively prevented. And whatever the Watchers are protecting, they're willing to do whatever it takes to maintain that protection." Despite everything, despite the threats, the disappearances, the mounting evidence that continuing would cost him everything, Jacob made one more discovery that convinced him the truth had to come out. It was a discovery that explained why Trapper had been so obsessed, why he'd refused to walk away, and why he'd known his time was running out. 3 weeks after Huckleberry vanished, I received a package, Jacob explains, holding up a padded envelope with no return address. Mailed from a town I'd never heard of, addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a camcorder, one of those old ones from the early 2000s that recorded to mini DV tapes. And there was a label on it, written in Trapper's handwriting. "For the boys." The tape inside that camcorder contained Trapper's final message, recorded alone in his cabin just days before his death. What he revealed on that tape is the core of everything, the reason for the Watchers, the truth about the phenomena, and the terrible knowledge that had sealed his fate. Trapper looked sick in that video, Jacob describes, playing fragments of the footage for his audience. Not just tired from investigation, but genuinely ill. His hands shook as he held notes. His voice was weaker than I'd ever heard it. But his eyes, they had this intensity, this desperate need to get the information out before time ran out. On the tape, Trapper confirmed what he discovered through years of research and those final months of obsessive investigation. The creatures the team had been chasing weren't isolated anomalies. They were connected through a network of underground tunnels that honeycombed throughout Appalachia, cave systems that had existed long before modern surveying, connecting sites dozens or even hundreds of miles apart. He'd found historical documents, Jacob explains, mining reports from the 1800s that described natural caverns of unusual size and structure that companies chose not to explore because workers refused to enter them. Geological surveys that noted extensive underground water systems that didn't follow normal patterns. Cave-ins at multiple locations that survivors described as deliberately collapsed, though that made no scientific sense. Trapper believed, and his research supported, that these tunnel systems were being used by the phenomena as migration routes. That the cryptids people had been seeing for generations weren't isolated species but members of a population that moved through the mountains unseen, using pathways that humans had only barely begun to map. But he'd found something else, Jacob continues, and his voice drops to match the gravity of the revelation. A location he called Red Hollow, the central point, the place where all the mapped tunnel systems seemed to originate or converge, the last circle on his map, the site he believed would explain everything. Trapper's final words on that tape were a warning. "If you're watching this, I'm gone, and you have to make a choice. You can protect yourselves by walking away, or you can finish this. But if you finish it, you need to understand. What's in Red Hollow isn't a discovery, it's a revelation. And revelations come at a cost." Despite every rational instinct screaming at him to destroy the tape and disappear, Jacob made his choice. He took Trapper's final map, equipped himself with basic documentation equipment, and went to find Red Hollow. It took me 6 days of searching, Jacob reports, following landmarks Trapper had described, navigating by topographical features that barely showed up on modern maps. I found it in a ravine so remote that I doubt 50 people in the last century have laid eyes on it. The ravine was exactly as Trapper had described: steep walls of exposed rock, a narrow entrance hidden behind fallen trees and thick vegetation, and throughout the area, carved into stone surfaces at regular intervals, those same symbols, 3 interlocking circles pierced by a downward arrow. Following the ravine deeper into the mountain, Jacob discovered the tunnels. Not natural cave formations, but passages that showed evidence of human modification. Tool marks in stone, support timbers that had rotted with age, and walls carved with more of those protective symbols. The tunnels went deep, Jacob describes, his video footage showing rough stone passages illuminated by his flashlight. I followed them for maybe half a mile before I started hearing it. A sound that didn't make sense, coming from somewhere far below. Not animal sounds, not geological settling, something rhythmic, almost like breathing, but too loud, too deep. Then he found it. The door. A massive wooden door bound with iron, chained shut, and covered in every protective symbol and warning glyph he'd seen throughout his investigation. The door was built into a natural stone formation, sealing off a passage that led deeper still into the mountain. I didn't open it, Jacob admits, and there's no shame in his voice, only the honest acknowledgement of boundaries he wasn't willing to cross. I stood there with my hand on those chains, listening to whatever was moving on the other side, and I understood why the Watchers existed, why they'd been protecting these sites for generations, why they were willing to threaten, to harm, maybe even to kill, to keep people away. Because what Trapper had found, what was still down there in those tunnels, wasn't just undiscovered animals or interesting cryptozoological specimens. It was something that fundamentally challenged assumptions about what lived in the mountains, how long it had been there, and what it would mean if it ever got out. Trapper's final journal entry, the one I found at that cairn, it makes sense now, Jacob says, reading the words with clear understanding. He wrote, "They're not myths. They're not undiscovered species. They're refugees, or prisoners, maybe both. And the Watchers aren't keeping us out. They're keeping something in." The section ends with Jacob describing what he did next. He left Red Hollow, but not before documenting everything he could. He photographed the door, the symbols, the tunnel systems. He recorded the sounds coming from behind that barrier, and then he did something that would either save him or condemn him. He called the Watchers. "I left a message at the site," Jacob reveals. "Told them I knew what they were protecting and why. Told them I would seal the entrance myself and mark it with their symbol if they would let me share what Trapper had discovered. Not the location, not how to find it, but the truth about what exists in these mountains." He never received a direct response. But when he returned to the ravine entrance the next day to collapse the approach tunnel as promised, he found that someone had already done it. The passage was sealed with precisely placed explosives that had brought down tons of rock, making the site inaccessible without industrial equipment. And in the dirt near the sealed entrance, pressed deep and clear, were those massive footprints, the same ones he'd seen behind his house. A final message: "We're watching. We're always watching." Jacob Lowe's video ends with visible exhaustion etched into every feature. The confident hunter who once led teams through dark hollers has been replaced by a man carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. But there's also relief. The relief of finally unburdening a secret that has haunted him for too long. "This will be my last public message about any of this," he states with finality. "I've done what Trapper needed. I've made sure his research wasn't buried completely. I've documented what we found and why it matters. But I'm also done. Done investigating, done pushing boundaries, done tempting the Watchers to take actions they've been warning against." He explains his final arrangement with brutal honesty. Huckleberry and I sealed that tunnel entrance ourselves before they finished the job. We marked it with their symbol, a promise that we understood and would respect their guardianship. I don't know if that's enough to keep us safe, but it's all I had to offer. The files he's releasing, hours of footage, documentation, trappers' journals, maps with locations deliberately obscured, represent a compromise between truth and safety. Enough information to honor his friend's legacy and prove that something extraordinary exists in Appalachian mountains, but not enough to allow others to make the same dangerous journey. I'm not giving you the location of Red Hollow, Jacob states firmly. I'm not providing detailed maps to the tunnel systems. Because Trapper was right. Some things are better left alone. The Watchers, whoever they are, whatever they've become over generations of guardianship, they're doing necessary work. They're keeping something contained that shouldn't be released. He looks directly into the camera, his final words carrying the weight of warning. Legends aren't just stories. They're not entertainment or colorful local folklore. Legends are warnings disguised as stories, passed down through generations because direct warnings get forgotten, but stories survive. Every tale about creatures in these mountains, every legend about places people shouldn't go, every warning from old-timers about respecting the deep woods. They're all pointing at the same truth. Jacob's face fills the frame one last time. Trapper died protecting that truth. Huckleberry vanished because of it. And He pauses, glancing nervously off-screen at something only he can see. His body language shifts immediately, tension replacing exhaustion. I have to go. If you don't hear from me again, the files will auto-upload to multiple servers. The dead man's switches are already set. The truth won't stay buried even if The video cuts off mid-sentence, not a fade to black or a planned ending. The frame simply stops, frozen on Jacob's face turning away from the camera, his hand reaching for something out of view. Then the screen goes dark. In the days since the video's release, Jacob Lowe's social media accounts have gone completely silent. Fans have called local authorities, filed missing person reports, and flooded forums with theories ranging from elaborate publicity stunt to genuine disappearance. Police in his area report doing a welfare check at his property and finding it empty but undisturbed, his truck gone, no signs of foul play. Willie McQuaid released a brief statement refusing to comment on Jacob's video but confirming that he and other former team members are also no longer investigating. Jeff Headley hasn't made any public statements at all. The only response came from an anonymous post on a cryptozoology forum 2 days after the video dropped. The message contained a single image, 3 interlocking circles pierced by a downward arrow, with text underneath that read, "The silence protects everyone. Let it stand." Mountain Monsters fans who grew up watching the team investigate Appalachian mysteries now find themselves part of a larger mystery, one that stretches beyond television, beyond entertainment, into the very real and dangerous shadows where truth and legend become indistinguishable. Did Jacob Lowe uncover something supernatural that has existed in those mountains for longer than human history? Or did he stumble into a conspiracy involving people willing to kill to protect secrets worth more than one man's life? Perhaps the most terrifying possibility is that both are true, that the phenomena are real, and so are the Watchers who have guarded them for generations. The video ends, but the questions it raises will haunt viewers long after the screen goes dark. What was behind that door in Red Hollow? What did Trapper really discover in those final days? What happened to Huckleberry? And most pressingly, where is Jacob Lowe now? The mountains keep their secrets, the legends endure, and somewhere in the deep hollers of Appalachia, in caves that don't appear on maps and ravines that only a handful of people have ever seen, the truth waits in darkness, guarded, protected, and more dangerous than anyone who hasn't faced it could possibly imagine. Legends are just warnings disguised as stories. Jacob Lowe made sure we heard the warning. Whether we heed it is now up to us.